This is an interview with Professor Don Elliott, a longtime Yale Law School professor, former General Counsel at the EPA, and a scholar practitioner whose work spans environmental law, administrative law, separation of powers, and complex litigation. In this conversation, he reflects on law, teaching, reading, faith, practical wisdom, and the idea that success comes from listening to what the world is calling you to do. You can read more about Professor Elliott on our website, 6degrees.blog, or our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you and enjoy this video.
Hello, welcome Professor Elliott to a 6 Degrees interview. My name is Santosh Subramanian, and it's a pleasure to have you on to talk a little bit with you with your background in law and just pick your brain a little bit. So could you first start off by introducing yourself, who you are, what you teach, and what your average day might look like?
Okay, that's a lot. Well, thank you. I welcome the opportunity. So my name is Edwin Donald Elliott Jr., but I go by Don Elliott. My father didn't like the first name Edwin, but he liked it well enough to give it to his son. So I always grew up being called Donald, and that's really what I go by. I was born in Chicago, which is where my family goes back for a couple of generations. And when I was a young boy, about 5 years old, my family moved to an old riverboat town in southern Indiana called Evansville, because my dad got a very good job there. And that's really where I grew up and went to high school. And my mother had been a teacher, and she continued what we would today call homeschooling with me, even though I went to public high school. My first and best teacher was clearly my mother, who taught me a great deal that I otherwise wouldn't have learned. And to the extent that I've had any success, it really is as a result of my mother's and father's influence. But I did well on standardized tests. I won a National Merit Scholarship, and I got an offer to go to Yale, which I was going to turn down, and stay in Indiana. But some of my friends from high school convinced me that I'd make a mistake if I didn't go to Yale. So this public high school kid from Indiana went to Yale, and it was a big culture shock. I was kind of prepared for it because through a program at Indiana University, I'd been an exchange student in Germany and spoke nothing but German for like 6 months. So I was used to being in different cultures, and I think that was a large part of my success. Is I was able to sort of see the culture. There's a famous line from Margaret Mead that a fish doesn't see the water it swims in, which is generally interpreted to mean that we don't see the parts of our culture. Our culture are those things that we take for granted and we don't see. And then when you live in another country, you suddenly see things both in that country and at home. But anyway, so I was successful at Yale and at Yale Law School. I've written a book, which you've been kind enough to read some. It's still a work in progress, but it's on the internet, and we'll let people take a look at it. But it describes some of the techniques I used to do well at Yale Law School. Among other things, I read things in addition to the things that the professor had assigned, and that gave me a great advantage on the exams. I finished first in my class, but also with the third best record in the history of the Yale Law School at that time. So then I went to clerk for two fine judges in Washington. I described some of that as a law clerk, as an assistant to a judge. And then I turned down some of the big law firms in Washington, went to work for a medium-sized firm so I could get more trial experience. And after 5, 6, 7 years, my former professors at Yale kept calling me up and offering to hire me back. And eventually I went, and I've been on the Yale Law School faculty since 1981, from 1981 to 1995, no, to 2025, so 44 years. And I just retired at the end of 2025. I'm still teaching. I've been given a very distinguished offer from China to go to China as a Yangtze River professor. That's an honor that's never been given to another American lawyer or academic. And I'm trying to decide whether or not to do that, but I probably will. I continue to teach by Zoom online. I taught a course last year in Brazil by Zoom. And upcoming, I'm going to teach a course at the Scalia Law School in the outskirts of Washington with a Brazilian law professor on comparative administrative law. My central subject is environmental law, but I also teach administrative law. and particularly that part of constitutional law, which we call separation of powers, which is about governmental structure and the relationship between different institutions. And also because of my 8 years of practical experience trying cases, I I also teach complex litigation and civil procedure because I have practical as well as theoretical experience. I guess that's enough for now. There was one other thing you asked me and I left it out, but I forget. I'm sure you'll ask me again.
Yeah, so that was kind of like you kind of did answer it with your teaching and practicing, but what might your typical day look like, either
Yeah,
now or back when you
let's
were?
talk about how I got into practice because that is what really, in many ways, makes me unique. In many other countries, and again, it illustrates the cultural point. In many other countries in the world, including Germany, many of the law professors also practice law on the side, and that's very rare in the United States. I was when I left EPA, I went back to Yale, and after a year or two, my then wife and the birth mother of my children decided that she wanted to divorce me, and that's all discussed about in the draft book. But I didn't want my two children, who were then teenagers, to have to drop out of their private school or move out of their house, and we couldn't continue just based on an academic salary. So I had practiced before, and I decided that I could, practice again some on the side. And so I started working with a New York law firm, and I found I really liked it. And I found it really enriched my teaching, and it caused me to be able to see things that other academics don't see. The tradition in the United States, I could give you the history, but you won't be probably interested in it. But we used to not have full-time law schools. People would just read with a lawyer. And when we started law schools, and Yale was really one of the first, not the first, but one of the first, there's a very strong separation between academic lawyers in the United States and practicing lawyers. And I didn't agree with that. I thought that it was very helpful to have the practical experience of actually serving in government and then actually being a lawyer. And I also discovered just by happenstance, and I think this illustrates one of my daughter's great expressions is, which is when given a lemon, make lemonade. Every bad thing in your life, or be careful what you wish for, you might get it. We're not smart enough to know what really to wish for. So you have to listen to the feedback that the universe is giving you, which is what I call epiphanies, or when God, in quotation marks, speaks to us. And you have to adapt your life to the feedback you're getting. Uh, I have had students who went to law school because their parents urged them to. And one of them I know really never practiced law. He's one of my best friends. He was an engineer. And after law school, he was the project manager on building the Los Angeles subway. A guy named Marvin Williams, a very close friend of mine. We were law school classmates, and we decided that we're brothers by different mothers. We just are really natural friends. And I think you have to listen to the feedback that the world is giving you. And I was very successful practicing law, and I enjoyed it. And so I just did the two. Most of my colleagues at Yale don't really approve of that or understand it. Some of them do. But I'll just end with one thing. One of my partners at Covington and Burling, who is a very very distinguished FDA lawyer and administrative lawyer, who also teaches part time at Harvard, said one time at an academic conference, "The administrative law you guys are talking about, there's no relationship whatsoever to the administrative law that I've practiced for 30 years." I wouldn't go quite that far, but I mean, I do think it's very useful to have the practical experience as well as the academic. And the academic helps me in practicing, and the practicing helps me in academia.
That's really interesting. Yeah, it's cool to see how both of them are kind of helping each other grow. I had a question. So you said that before law schools weren't like full time you were reading and with a practicing lawyer. So is it almost like an apprenticeship sort of
Yeah.
situation?
Yes. And there's still a couple of places in the country where you can do that. But for example, Illinois is one of them, I think, where you don't have to go to law school. You can apprentice with a lawyer and then take the bar exam. And if you pass it, you're a lawyer. For example, Abraham Lincoln never went to law school. He read law with a lawyer, and really the law schools, the full time law schools in the United States, really date from the 19th century.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that it was almost like an apprenticeship system and that it still runs today.
Well,
Um,
it still is kind of an
mhm.
apprenticeship in the sense that most law students who graduate from Yale or Harvard or Berkeley or any of the top law schools, recognize that they don't really have enough practical experience. Now, it's better if you've done a lot of clinical programs in law school, and Yale has become much more oriented toward clinical programs since I was a student. I graduated in 1974. Most of what I did in law school was work at legal aid and actually do, divorce cases and housing cases, eviction cases, and things like that. And I loved it. I loved practicing law, and I never really wanted to, to give it up. And that goes back partly to my background and actually to my mother. When we moved to Evansville, they didn't have TV stations yet. They were building one, so I couldn't watch Howdy Doody, which was my favorite activity as a 5-year-old. So my mother took me down to the courthouse, and we would sit in and watch murder trials, uh, as entertainment. That was something that went back in my mother's background. So I had a lot of experience, and I learned a lot about how to try cases from the lawyers in Evansville, who were really very good. Trying cases in front of juries is a lost art. We don't try very many cases today. We settle almost all of them.
Yeah, that's interesting. So a lot of like learning by doing almost, is that
Right,
right?
right, right. And the dean at Yale, whose name was Heather Gerken, for the last 10 years or so, I don't know exactly. She's just gone to be the president of the Ford Foundation. But Heather, who had not gone to Yale, who'd gone to Michigan, really reoriented the law school to have greater emphasis on clinical programs. And I'm 100% in favor of that. In fact, I founded the environmental clinic at the Yale Law School. And in fact, there was a group of other clinics there that were all doing, poverty work, and they would not allow the environmental clinic to be part of that umbrella organization because they viewed it as a middle class phenomenon and not really doing poverty law, which, that was before we had developed the environmental justice movement
Yeah.
in environmental law.
That's cool. So to switch tracks a little bit, you had said that you mentioned your working book Epiphanies briefly, and you talked about how if you have to listen to the feedback that the world is giving you, which is like kind of what your paper is about. So to people who haven't read the book yet, what might you explain it as, or what's like what is the book about?
Right. Okay, I've got one. Well, I was raised as a Presbyterian, and in some ways, the book is about all the things that I was taught, both by my family and my church, growing up, that I didn't understand, at the time, and then later, as I got older and hopefully wiser, I could sort of see what the world was telling me. But one of the things that the Presbyterians believe is that you don't get married, you celebrate your marriage. The marriage has already taken place in the relationship between two people, and they view the wedding as a celebration in which you announce your relationship to the community, and the community blesses it. And the other thing they do is they tell you that you're not supposed to choose your profession. That's the key one. You don't choose your profession. You're called to do something. And your job is to figure out what you're called to do, to figure out where you fit, and where you can make the biggest contribution. And I was always interested in the relationship between science and law. I was very much influenced by the writings of a fellow named Barry Commoner, who was a scientist at St. Louis University, who wrote books in the late 60s and early 70s about the environment, which are just really wonderful books. I would recommend them. But when I was clerking on the D.C. Circuit, which is the court right below the Supreme Court that gets all the administrative law cases, my judge, I went to work for him, is a man named David Bazelon, who was the judge that was most interested in the relationship between law and science, in part because his best friend was the head of the National Academy of Sciences. And he assigned my co-clerk from Harvard all of the insanity defense cases, and he assigned me all the environmental cases. And I just thought my life was ruined because at that time, law and science was mostly about the insanity defense. But the judge, who was a wonderful man, took me aside very, very quietly and said, "Don, it's actually more important in the long run." And really the first case I worked on was the one that was a challenge to EPA taking the lead out of gasoline, which has turned out to be one of the best decisions that EPA ever made from a public health standpoint. And I won't go into all of it, but he put me in the route of environmental law. Well, I resisted it 5 or 6 different times. The world was calling me toward environmental law, and I wasn't listening. And finally, after 3 or 4 false starts where I tried to do other things, including spending half my time litigating, cases in front of juries rather than just doing environmental law. Finally, I got the opportunity to be General Counsel of EPA, which is the top lawyer at EPA. And at that point, I gave up and accepted my fate and said, okay, I'm an environmental lawyer. And most of my writing since then, a lot of my teaching is in the environmental law area. I didn't give up the other interests entirely. But, I think that's what the Presbyterians mean when you listen to what the world is calling you to do. And I'll just give one more example. In my entryway as a freshman at Yale, there was one guy who wanted to be a cartoonist. And everybody thought that was crazy because you were a doctor or you lawyer or you went to Wall Street or you did all this. But damn it, Gary Trudeau did just really fine as a cartoonist. And I think that's a good example of if you're called to do something, there's a really good chance that you should do it. My son, after he went to college, worked for a couple of years on Wall Street, and I didn't say anything, but I was kind of disappointed that he was just making money. And he worked part-time on the weekends as an emergency medical technician, riding around on an ambulance, and found he loved it. And that was as a result of having worked as a volunteer fireman when he was in college, but he loved being an EMT. So he finally went back to school at Columbia to do a post-bac program and ultimately went to medical school and became an orthopedic surgeon. He's now on the faculty of a medical school in New Orleans and an orthopedic surgeon and just loves what he does every day. He did 4 operations yesterday. And I asked him why he likes it so much, and he tells me, well, this guy comes in, he can't walk, and I operate on him, and I see him a week later, and he's walking. And people are just so grateful at the very tangible achievement. So that's what he was called to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I have a question regarding kind of your answer. So you said that you've kind of known, or at least retrospectively, you've known that environmental law was your calling, but you resisted it a couple of times, but there was a point where you almost gave up and just gave into, going all in on environmental law. So what do you mean by like you resisted and then there was a point where you kind of just gave up? Like what was that point?
Well, just one quick example is that when I was leaving my clerkship and looking for my first full-time job, I had an offer from a boutique firm, very fine firm, that specialized in environmental law, and I decided not to take it. And I went to a different law firm because I liked the people and I liked the other aspects of the firm better, even though they didn't have an environmental department. And a couple of months later, they hired a guy from EPA named Roger Strelo, who was one of the founders of EPA, and he became my mentor. They sent a memo around, anybody know any environmental law? So again, I kept being directed. If I listened, if I had learned to listen to the signals a little bit better, I probably would have done some things differently. But it all worked out. So I kept trying to. I mean, I guess the central error is you cannot impose your will on the universe. The more you try, the more there's adverse feedback, and the more it hurt. I had a very close student who was a research assistant who called me up after she'd been about 10 years out, and she said, "I hate my life." And I said, "Why?" And she said, "Well, I always wanted to be a veterinarian." And I said, "Well, go be a veterinarian." And she said, "Oh, I can't. I'm divorced. I've got a kid, and so on. But you only go around once, and you have to do something." Here's one of the clues: you ought to do some kind of work that you're sort of surprised when they pay you. You're not doing it for the money. I mean, I'm going to teach at Scalia for free. They typically pay adjuncts, small amount, and I've been paid in the past, but I do it for free, and in fact, I do it for free. So
Interesting. Yeah. So that phrase that you said is very powerful. You cannot impose your will on the universe. What do you think that might look like? So if there's a person and they're kind of struggling, like you said, that research assistant, what do you think imposing your will on the universe looks like, and why might that be a bad idea to keep doing that?
well, the reason it's a bad idea is it's not going to work, and it's going to make you unhappy. I believe, and again, a lot of this is in the book, but I believe that heaven is a metaphor for when we're living in harmony with the universe. So I feel like I'm in heaven right now, but that's because I'm in harmony with my wife, who I love very much, and with my life. And you can feel it when you're trying. There's a wonderful myth. If people haven't read it, one of the great authors is a fellow named Joseph Campbell, who talks about. He has a wonderful book called The Power of Myth, and it was a PBS series. If you actually do a search on the internet, you can find it for free on the internet now. Joseph Campbell, The Power of Myth. And Campbell's theory is that all of the great religions are driving at some of the same points, because there's another realm which they call spiritual, which you cannot express. This is his theory, which you cannot express in concrete metaphors, because it's in a different realm. And he believes that most of the world's great religions are all driving at some of the same key points. And I've actually found, and one of the things he says is, sometimes you can learn more from reading other religions than you can your own, because you grow up as a child, and so you have a sort of childish understanding of things in your own religion. And then you go read the Quran, for example, and or learn. Confucianism was particularly important to me. Many of the same points that Jesus made are made by Confucius in his Analects, which are notes essentially taken by his disciples, because he really worked before we had Gutenberg and published books. But his students wrote down notes. I've often wondered what I'd look like if people only knew me through my students' notes. But that's another issue. No, I think that there's in Greek mythology, there's this idea of the myth of Sisyphus. Have you heard of that? It's about this guy that keeps pushing the rock up the hill and it rolls back down. Well, it rolls back down because of the laws of nature and the laws of the universe. And he keeps trying to push it up. He's trying to impose his will on the universe, and the rock keeps rolling back down. So it's the same lesson, but kind of in different words. You can't control the universe. You can control some little aspects of it. Like we talk about the fact before we got on that, I make it a practice to cook once a week and take my wife out for dinner at least once a week. So she likes to cook. She's a very good cook, and that's kind of her outcome. But her one of the ways she gives love is by cooking for people. But nonetheless, So that's not imposing your will on the universe. It's trying to accommodate your content to the to the way the universe works. If she had to cook for me 7 nights a week and I just sat around, it wouldn't be good. So I'm now wise enough about how the universe works that I try to take some of that burden off her. That's not imposing your will on the universe. And as long as we're talking about these big issues, I'd like to share with your listeners what I think is the most important thing that I could share with them, or what's really the way I live my life. I'm an Aristotelian. I was privileged in my first year at Yale to read all the great classics in a program that they had copied from the University of Chicago called the Great Books Program. It's called Directed Studies at Yale, but you read all of the classical authors. And the ones you don't read, you hear about, you hear their names. And so I read some books about the ones that I hadn't read in college. I think most people stop reading when they're out of college, and I discovered that the people who keep reading do systematically better than the people who stop. But I read a lot of nonfiction, but my wife reads a lot of novels and so on. But in any event, I think the great principle behind Aristotle is moderation in all things, or as otherwise said, a virtue carried to an extreme becomes a vice. And so I've tried to have, moderation. I think that as I look around at the people that I've known, my peers, I think those of them who have focused all their activity on a single thing, as opposed to living a more balanced or more moderated life, end up being unhappy. And I think a lot of these principles of morality and religion are really principles about how to live a happy life if you can decode them. And the purpose of this book is for me to sort of try to decode some of what I call epiphanies, which are moments when the universe is teaching us a greater lesson, but you have to be wise enough to be able to understand it. And many of the parables in the Bible are like that. So my favorite is the feeding of 5,000, where the little boy comes up and he offers his food, and suddenly there's 5,000 people, and that's enough food to feed 1,000 people. Well, the point of the story is not, in my view, that Jesus developed some magical way of manufacturing more food by kind of cloning loaves and fishes. It is rather that sharing is contagious, and that the little boy's example caused all the other people in the crowd to share the food that they'd brought with them, and suddenly there was enough for everyone. But that's a good example of things that I could not understand, at least as a child growing up. But as I got older and I studied text, I did my undergraduate major was in literature and poli-sci. I did a double one, but literature was very valuable. And then I did a year of graduate school on a fellowship in the English department at Yale. I thought I might want to be an English professor. And for various reasons, I decided to be a law professor rather than an English professor. But I was kind of always destined to be a law professor. When I was in junior high, they did a little profile of me in the local newspaper. They did one a week. It was called King of the Week, and I still have mine. And they asked me what I wanted to do, and I said I want to be a professor of jurisprudence, which was rather arrogant for a junior in public high school in southern Indiana, but nonetheless, it ended up being where I ended up. But I went through a lot of things along the way before I got there.
That's very interesting. And to go not necessarily off track, but not on the same track, really briefly, you said people who keep reading do better than people who stop. So I have a question. In our generation, like in my generation and my youth, with more and more of my peers who are kind of not reading, period, like who are not opening books, instead just like AI summarizing stuff, what do you think that means for the future of the world and the future of like academia with people who aren't reading as much?
Well, I think it means that there are going to be two classes, really, of people. And I think there already are. The people who continue to read and the people who just regard education as a form of professional training, and rather than teaching people more valuable life lessons. So, for example, one of the things that really irritates me is I think the single most important thing that most people do in their lives is raise children. And we don't teach in the high schools how to raise children. You know, they taught me, and we don't teach a lot of very basic life skills in the like cooking. I mean, maybe that's different today. When I was in high school, it was very sexist, and the girls all got to take home ec, which would teach them how to cook, and the guys all got to take industrial arts, which would teach them how to run machines and fix things. And it was just the beginning of the sexual revolution or feminism. And a bunch of girls said, we want to take industrial arts too. And a bunch of the boys said, well, we want to learn how to cook too. So I think one of the best things that has happened in my lifetime is that I think the sexual roles have loosened up a little bit. And we all recognize, I think, or most people recognize today that, we're all a mix of both male and female, which is why I use the pronoun they in because I think I'm as much my mother as I am my father. They both had a influence on me. Maybe my mother was 60% and my father was 40%. I don't know, but they both were big influences on me. And that's great. That's good because everybody is unique. But I'll just stop there.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the kind of two classes is very interesting. And to go back a little bit, you said the phrase work-life balance. So clearly you've kind of done a lot of thinking, read a lot, have a lot of life experience. What is maybe your biggest piece of advice to make sure that even starting young, like I am in high school right now, what advice might you give that I can keep in mind going through college, getting my first job, getting married, that I can prioritize my work-life balance?
Boy, that's a toughie. Well, I think it's important to. Well, let me go back a little bit. So one of the things from taking a look at the book is that when I was in my mid-20s, I nearly died because I had a reservation on a flight back from my grandfather's funeral, and my mother called me up and said, Donnie, don't come because the weather's bad. So for some reason, I listened to her. I was very oppositional at the time in my 20s. So I kind of consider it a miracle that I listened to her and didn't go. But the plane crashed, and on it, everybody on it was killed. And that obviously changed my life. And one of the things it taught me is that one should live one's life every day as a gift. It helps to say a little prayer in the morning where you say thank you for the for the blessing of this new day. The Irish have a wonderful saying, don't complain about old age. Not everybody gets the privilege, but try to live each day as you would want to live it if it were your last day on earth, because you don't know when your last day on earth is going to be. Could be tomorrow. So that probably means that you don't really want to do a whole series of 18-hour days back to back. If you have to do them, you want to also respect your body and set aside some time for reasonable exercise. You want to eat reasonably and not overeat. Again, one of the things that I deplore is, at least when I was growing up, they didn't teach us a lot of these basic life skills, like about eating. Like one of the things I didn't know until recently, for example, is if you eat until you're no longer hungry, you've eaten twice too much, because it takes 20 to 30 minutes for the blood sugar to come up in your body, and you feel not hungry. So if you eat about half of what you normally would, and then say to yourself, okay, I'm going to wait 15 minutes, but if I want to go back and finish this up, I will. You never go back. If you wait the 15 or 20 minutes, your blood sugar comes up and you're perfectly satisfied, but you've only got half as many calories, and you'll feel great if you're not overweight. Almost everybody in our society is overweight, and it's a result of eating habits. We are making the GLPs available, and that's good. I'm all for that, but we ought to teach kids in the schools in the public schools important life lessons. Not, I don't use my trigonometry much. Every once in a while, I get or analytic geometry. I'm glad I did analytic geometry, but I haven't used analytic geometry since high school. And I have to eat every day. I have to exercise, and I think we'd do a better job if we taught people some of those life skills. But we don't, so you have to pick them up along the way. One of my favorite authors is Calvin, who was a lawyer as well as the head of his polity. Another is Confucius. I heard their names in college, but I never read anything by them. And I read another one is Erasmus. He's got a funny name, and he spent a lot of time arguing with Martin Luther. He's actually the funniest author I have ever read. Erasmus's dialogues are just hilarious. Particularly given your age, read the one about he has an imaginary dialogue between a suitor and his intended, and it is just hilarious. So these are people whose names I'd heard, but I got books and read them and learned a lot that way. I think that's very important. We did that with my kids, and that's one of the things my father did with me. My father, who was very wise, bought a set of the World Book encyclopedias and put them in my bedroom when I was a child. And every night when I was supposed to be going to sleep, I'd pull down a volume of the World Book encyclopedia and just read it. And one of the things I learned is I just learned all sorts of miscellaneous stuff that other people didn't know. And, when it came to taking those exams, both to get into college and then to get a National Merit Scholarship or Yale National Scholarship, I knew a lot of nonfiction. So I mostly read nonfiction. When I was in graduate school, I specialized in novels, and I've read a lot of novels, but I find nonfiction is really useful, and I read a lot of nonfiction today on the internet. And you earlier sort of proposed reading and the internet as in opposition, and they can be, but there's also an awful lot of great stuff on the internet that you can read today, particularly books that are no longer in copyright. Ebooks that you can just get for free and download them on the internet. And mostly, I read old books. I used to go to old bookstores and just shop and look around, and I'd see a book by Erasmus, and I'd heard Erasmus's name. So I'd buy it for $1 and read it. You can now do all that online. It doesn't cost anything. I learned a lot that way. And I spend most of my day reading. I spend 2 or 3 hours a day reading, but most of it is on the internet. So, the internet world really opens up all of the world's knowledge to each of us. You just need to know how to use it. And if I had it to do and I were teaching in a high school, I'd teach a course on how to use the internet properly.
Yeah, so kind of speaking of that, like if I taught a course in high school, do you think in the future our education systems, especially in high school, and maybe even in college, will be able to integrate kind of those life skills into, maybe public school education?
Well, I hope so. I'm not real confident about that, and I'm not really confident that because I think a lot of that needs to be done at home or in other organizations like the YMCA or the Boy Scouts or a lot of what I did and a lot of what other lawyers did was shaped by our experiences in high school debate. That was good training for becoming a lawyer. And I know very few lawyers who didn't go through the high school debate aspect. Now, there are different kinds of lawyers. Not every lawyer, maybe only 5% of lawyers are in court trying cases, but still it's very good training. And I think a lot of those things, and I should be honest, I think NGOs do a better job of this than the public schools do. I think the role of teachers unions is not really very positive, has not been very positive. There's a great line. There's a fellow named Eric Fromm, Fromm. He was very famous in the 1970s. He was a longshoreman, but he also wrote books about philosophy and the idea of having a longshoreman who wrote books. And a longshoreman is a guy who unloads ships, if you don't know the word. And he wrote a series of books that are just wonderful and sort of down to earth, common sense things. But one of the things he said is that every movement becomes a cause, which then becomes a business, which then becomes a racket. And I've seen that happen with lots of things in my lifetime. It's a good thing, and again, this is Aristotle. It gets carried too far. It's a good thing, and then people figure out a way to make money from it, so it becomes a racket, becomes a business, and then it becomes a racket. And I think, for example, and we're going to talk about it later, I think that's kind of happened with climate change. I believe climate change is real, and we should deal with it, and that prudent measures against climate change make a lot of sense. But I also believe that 100 years from now, that when people look back, they will consider some of our approaches to be pretty primitive. Like, people used to use candles rather than electric lights. I think it's a perfect example of what Eric Fromm said of things. It's a reasonable movement, the environmental movement. It became a cause, and I was very active in it and essentially devoted my life to it. But then, it becomes a business, and then involves millions of dollars, or billions of dollars. So here's an example, just to try and illustrate it. EPA has been around since 1970, and its research budget is typically half $500 million, to $1 billion a year. That's what it's been consistently in Republican administrations and Democrat administrations. And in the last year of the Biden administration, the Congress gave EPA $38 billion to give away to whoever they want to promote climate change activities. My law firm was asked to represent an NGO that had been set up for the sole purpose of distributing money, and they didn't exist the year before, and they had a total paid-in capital of $250, and none of the people had experience outside of government, and they were going to get $4 billion from EPA to give away however they wanted. And some of these things that the NGOs were doing, they were giving people in disadvantaged areas, complete new kitchens because they would produce less greenhouse gases. So, a lot of people got really rich, and a lot of the people that were heading up these NGOs over nominally good purposes got paid millions of dollars. I saw one yesterday. I think, don't hold me to this, but I believe I saw on television yesterday that the head or the CEO of the Southern Leadership Conference, was making millions of dollars a year, and I won't say how many million, but it was more than one. So I think that's Eric Fromm's principle, that things that start out as a movement become a cause. Like a lot of environmental groups are organized to support the cause and have done very good work and have made huge difference. One of the reasons that our environmental laws are much more stringent than our occupational laws is the role of environmental groups and pushing the agencies to do things. But in any event, I've seen that happen in my lifetime over and over again, and there's a good theoretical basis for why that happens in game theory, which I won't go through in any detail. But once the movement becomes a cause, then it's able to achieve a large amount of investment, and then the huge budgets attract not only people to make money out of them, but people who figure out a racket. So, you have these things like the fraud with the hospices in Minnesota, or the hospices in California where 97% of the people survive, or the daycare centers in Minnesota. When you create a large pool of money for things that are nominally for good purposes, that large pool of money is going to attract a lot of flies. That's what Eric Fromm really means when he talks about things becoming a racket. And there's good game theory for that. that when you have a situation, the very success of people in cooperating creates a surplus that attracts pirates, and that really is the academic explanation for what Eric Fromm is talking about. So that's the reason that I think privately funded NGOs are a lot better at doing some of this, because if they're not doing a good job, or if they're paying their people too much, or not doing the right things, people won't contribute to them. But oftentimes in government continues to fund things because it has a cute name, and that's partly because the federal government has gotten to be so big and so complex that Congress doesn't make most of the laws. It delegates most of the political decisions to career bureaucrats within the agencies, who make 90% of the laws that actually impact people through notice and comment rulemaking. So Congress passes a law that says set national ambient air quality standards that protect public health with an ample margin of safety. And then it gives it over to EPA to figure out what that actually means. And they create a number of rules, and then the states have to implement them, and it works all the way down. This is called cooperative federalism. But what it means is that people in Congress are in the business of running for office, and this is never really contemplated by our founders. My latest article, which hasn't come out yet, but will come out by the time this appears, is in the American Spectator, and the title is "America's Biggest Problem? Our Antiquated Constitution." We have the world's oldest constitution. It's very difficult to amend. And a lot of the recurrent problems that we have in the United States are because we've done very little to learn from other countries who do some things more successfully than we do. So maybe that's one of the things I'll do in the few years remaining, is try to stimulate a discussion about what it would do if we were to call a second constitutional convention and rewrite it. I co-taught this course in Brazil, and with a Brazilian law professor, and Brazil's constitution is from 1988. Ours is from 1789, so almost a 200-year difference. And when you revise your constitution in the year 2000, you can learn from lots of experience in other countries, and they do some things better than we do. So, for example, just to give one example, one of the big controversies today is to what extent the president has authority to direct various parts of the government, like the Department of Justice, or whether or not there should be agencies that are separate and immune from presidential control, like the Federal Reserve Board. That's an ongoing issue. It's before the Supreme Court in a number of cases right now. A friend of mine, a law professor in Germany, asked me about that a few years ago. I told him, well, we're still arguing about that. And he said, well, what, you mean you guys have had a country for 250 years and you haven't figured that out yet? So I'm afraid so. So, the Brazilian Constitution takes certain agency decisions and specifically puts them beyond presidential control, and it makes others specifically subject to legislative control or presidential control. So we asked all the students in this class in Brazil, which was at FGV Law School, which is their leading law school, where one of my former students is the dean. This sort of shows how your influence, spreads out around the world. This guy was in my class, and so now they invite me down to, Rio de Janeiro to give lectures, and I meet this young law professor there, and we co-teach a course, and now we're going to co-teach a course at Scalia Law School in comparative administrative law. So this is how your influence spreads out through other people, and I argue in the book that that's what it means when in the Bible it talks about everlasting life. It means your influence continues through the lives of the people that you've influenced and the books you've written and the people you've taught, and it spreads out. It gets diffuse and combined with other people, but it's kind of like the genetic process in which your son ends up looking like you, and but I think a lot of the people, and so for example, I have an environmental law book that just the second edition has come out. It's called Advanced Introduction to Environmental Law. It's published by a British publisher called Elgar. And my two co-authors are both former students of mine, Dan Esty and Adam Babich at Tulane, both of whom have gone on to be distinguished environmental law professors. Would they have done that without my influence? Probably. I don't know. But in any event, I'm very proud that I may have had contributed something to them, and we continue to try to spread our influence throughout the world. My brother-in-law, who married his high school sweetheart, who was my sister, and they continue to live in Evansville. They had a wonderful life, very different than mine. I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're just different with different challenges. But his name's Bill Drebus. And he said one time Jesus' greatest miracle was that he had 33 disciples when he had 12 disciples when he was 33, and 11 of them were loyal to him. That's not entirely accurate, but imagine, Jesus was just one of many rebels in that period that were put to death. There's a book that one of my atheist friends gave me called Rebel about that. And most of the others are, crucified and nobody ever heard of them. What made Jesus different was his message and the fact that Paul and others spread them throughout the world. And that's what I think they mean when they say in the Presbyterian Church, the church is the body of Christ in the world. You continue to live on through the lives of the people you've influenced, whether they're your children or your students or the people who've read your books. I mean, Barry Commoner lives on through me. I was inspired by Barry Commoner. So, I devoted my life to environmental law. Probably wouldn't have done that if I hadn't been influenced by Barry Commoner's books when I was in high school.
All right, it's very interesting. Thank you so much for your insights. I know that kind of went all over the place, but I thought it was really interesting. And I'm noticing that we're kind of ending that 1 hour period. My last question is that you talk a lot about, like religions and cultures. You just talked about how one of kind of the issues with our country right now, aside from like our outdated constitution, is that, maybe we're not looking to other countries' solutions as much. What do you think we can like? How much do you think we can start learning from other cultures and other religions, and how might that be able to change the way an individual lives? So not necessarily on like the government level, but on like a personal level.
Say that again about the last part about the individual level.
Mm-hmm. So kind of on an individual or personal level, how much do you think people truly can learn from other cultures and especially other religions?
Okay. Well, one of my great mentors is an author named Herbert Simon, who actually won the Nobel Prize for economics, but he wasn't really an economist. They just didn't have any place else to put him. He was what was called a polymath. He was an expert in a lot of things. But what Herbert Simon's main point is that human beings have limited cognitive capacity. Our brains are not like computers in the sense that you can't erase things. Every memory or sense impression we have makes a permanent biological change. It's all there. And the estimates are that each person in their lifetime gets about 4 trillion data bits. I also read books about brain science. Nobody who teaches environmental law and administrative law knows any brain science, with the possible exception of Cass Sunstein and me. So we see a bunch of stuff that other people don't see. But anyway, what Herbert Simon was trying to teach us is the role of expertise. And the reason that we create government agencies, and I would add non-government organizations, the reason we create organizations generally is nobody can be an expert in everything. So being an expert means you concentrate unduly on one or two areas to the cost of not knowing, other things. So, I worked briefly as an electrician's mate, or I took courses in computer science, but I don't know about as much about electricity or computer science as if I had devoted my entire life to them. So I think part of what you learn from books, from other cultures and from other religious and spiritual traditions. I would include witchcraft in that. I think the witches knew a hell of a lot of stuff, so it's not just Orthodox religions. I think there are lots and lots of these things where if you learn them, you're able to tap into storehouses of knowledge. You don't have to rediscover everything for yourself. Uh, when you read Erasmus's dialogue, it teaches you how to rule a woman and what women are interested in. That's a very important thing. When I picked where to go, and I'll stop with this, when I picked where to go to spend my career, I graduated from the Yale Law School. I had these clerkships in Washington. I really could have gone anywhere. Some of my friends went to California. My law school roommate went to Florida and founded what's now the third largest law firm in Florida, a guy named John Sumberg. We're still very close. I talked to him just a couple of days ago. I could have done anything, but I decided to go to Washington because I like the women. Here I was, 25 years old. I had no idea about what law practice would be in the next generation. But, I like the women in Washington, D.C. better than the women in New York or in Evansville or in Chicago or whatever. So I was kind of a connoisseur at 25 of what I liked in women. And I went to Washington because I thought I would meet the love of my life there. And, I was right. She not only is, beautiful and loving and giving and a great cook, but she has a PhD in toxicology from MIT and was the former head of the toxicology program at the National Academy of Sciences. She's my best co-author, best editor, and the love of my life. But I never would have met her if I hadn't been wise enough at 25 to go to Washington. And with that, which may be helpful to your people your age, your peer group, because I know, when I was 25, that was the most important thing to me as members of the opposite sex. And they don't have to be the opposite sex. I think one of the best things that's happened in my lifetime is that we're much more, I think, liberated about people who don't fit into the conventional sexual category. Just to give you one point of experience about that. When I was about your age, Santosh, the news came out that President Lyndon B. Johnson's national security advisor, a man named Walter Jenkins, was homosexual, and he committed suicide because it was such a blot at the time. And today we have several open homosexual males that are in the president's cabinet, and that's one of the best things that's happened in my lifetime, in my opinion. So things can change and things can get better in some areas. But with that, I guess that's a good place to leave it. So thank you very much for listening to me for this and for publicizing some of my thoughts. And I hope people will check out the draft book, which will eventually be published, but still a work in progress, at my blog, which is https://epiphanies, plural, .blog, epiphanies.blog. Thank you very much.